Who is this Melchizedek? It's what the author wants to answer in verses 1 to 10. Now, question 2. And there's a punchline coming, I promise. Here is. Why is Jesus, our new high priest, not taken from the tribe of Levi? It's the question the author answers now in verses 11 through 19, and he gives us 3 answers. Firstly, because the old covenant priesthood was ineffective at bringing people to God. Verse 11. Now, if perfection had been attainable through the Levitical priesthood, for under it the people received the law, we're getting close now, there's our word, huh? What further need would there be for another priest to arise after the order of Melchizedek, rather than the one named after the order of Aaron? Now, guys, what is the purpose of a priesthood? What are the great ends for which a priesthood exists? The answer is simple. The work of a priest is to present to the deity a sacrifice satisfying divine justice. Why does a priest perform this work? To secure the favor on the part of that deity on behalf of those he represents, so that in turn they might draw near that deity, come close to that deity, and have access to that deity. That's the idea that's caught up in this term perfection. It's a word that possesses a very specialized meaning in the book of Hebrews. It's not used as we often use the term, without flaw or without mistake. Someone who's made perfect is without moral blemish. No, it's used in a much more objective sense, emphasizing completion or fulfillment. In other words, in Hebrews, the term perfection refers to the completion of God's plan of salvation, with the result that the people for whom this plan has been completed are now brought into a right relationship with God and thus enjoy uninhibited access to Him. That's the purpose of priesthood, is to serve. That's why you need a priesthood. And it's the author's point here. If the Levitical priesthood could have successfully accomplished God's plan of salvation, why do you think then that God, several hundred years after instituting the Levitical priesthood, would prophesy in Psalm 110 of the need for a different kind of priest from an altogether different order? God is establishing the seminal ideas of a greater priesthood, you see? You see what the author is doing, huh? He's establishing a logical deduction referred to as a syllogism. You know what a syllogism is, right? Major premise, minor premise, conclusion. Major premise. If perfection were attainable through the Levitical priesthood, there would be no need for a different kind of priest. Minor premise. Since God, in Psalm 110, predicted a different kind of priest would come, there must have been a need for a different kind of priest. Conclusion. Perfection, the completion of God's saving plan, was not attainable through the Levitical priesthood. What's he saying? The old system couldn't get the job done. It was non-effectual in terms of accomplishing the primary objective a priesthood is intended to accomplish, that of bringing people near to God. And it was ineffectual for a couple of reasons. One, because of the inadequacy of the priests, who, just like the people they represented, they were lawbreakers themselves. Right? In fact, verse 27 tells us that before a priest could ever make an offering for people, he first had to make an offering for himself. By the way, put it in neutral for a moment. Have you ever noticed that the Scriptures almost intentionally repeatedly record the wickedness and sins of the Levitical priests? One only needs to consider a man like Aaron, an idolater, leading the people in the worship of the golden calf. His sons, Nadab and Abihu, consumed for fooling around inside the tabernacle, getting drunk and doing something in there, we don't know what. Eli, the glutton and passive father. His sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who used the priestly office to satisfy their sexual appetites. All through the major and minor prophets, we read of the unfaithfulness of the Levitical priests. We come to the New Testament, and what do we read about? Stellar characters like Annas and Caiaphas. Priests driven by a lust for money and power who plotted the arrest and crucifixion of the Son of God. Is it any wonder that the old system couldn't get the job done? The priests were grossly inadequate. And secondly, they couldn't get the job done because their offerings were inadequate. How could an unwilling, uncomprehending animal serve as a legitimate substitute for a human sinner? Keep your finger here. Go to chapter 10. Keep your finger here. Turn to chapter 10. Verse 1. For since the law has but a shadow, well, that's language we also get in Colossians. Law is a shadow, law is a shadow, law is a shadow. What does a shadow anticipate? A coming substance. For since the law has but a shadow of the good things to come, instead of the true form of these realities, it can never, by the same sacrifices that are continually offered every year, make perfect those who draw near. Notice verse 4. For it is impossible for the blood of bulls and goats to take away sins. Verse 11. And every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices, which can never take away sins. The unending repetition proved the inefficacy of these sacrifices. You say, but wait a minute, Art, the priests were inadequate? The offerings were inadequate? I thought the priests and the offerings were God's idea to begin with. Are you suggesting that God's design was inadequate? No. I'm insisting that they're inadequate. The only question is, why was it inadequate? Why couldn't the Levitical priesthood get the job done? There are two possibilities. God's weakness. God wanted to save people through the old covenant sacrificial system, but his attempts were thwarted by human sinfulness. Or possibility two, God's intention. That is to say, God's design was inadequate by intention. The Levitical priesthood was always intended to be prefigurative. It was never purposed to be the means by which the saving plan of God was to be completed, only to foreshadow the perfect priest and his sacrificial offering that would get the job done. Notice verse 11. Every priest stands daily at his service, offering repeatedly the same sacrifices which can never take away sins. But when Christ had offered for all time a single sacrifice for sins, he sat down at the right hand of God, waiting from that time until his enemies should be made a footstool for his feet. For by a single offering he has perfected for all time those who are being sanctified. And the Holy Spirit also bears witness to us, for after saying, "This is the covenant that I will make with them after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws on their hearts and write them on their minds." Then he adds, "I will remember their sins and their lawless deeds no more. Where there is forgiveness of these, there is no longer any offering for sin." The old system couldn't get the job done by design. There's a second reason it couldn't get the job done. It was attached to a covenant that has been replaced. And we're going to get to law right now, guys. All of this was to lead you to a point that, had I just read the single verse, I don't think it would have the same impact, okay? The old covenant priesthood was attached to a covenant that has been replaced. At the foot of Mount Sinai, that's where God enters into a covenantal relationship with the people of Israel. He would be their God, they would be his people. Exodus 19. The official covenant document, like our Constitution, was the tablets of stone Moses brought down from the mountain, the Ten Commandments. In fact, the Ten Commandments were so much identified with the establishment of the Old Covenant, they were referred to as the Old Covenant. So, for example, Exodus 34, then the Lord said to Moses, "Write down these words, for in accordance with these words I have made a covenant with you and with Israel." Moses was there with the Lord 40 days and 40 nights without eating bread or drinking water, and he wrote on the tablets the words of the covenant, the Ten Commandments. You say, well, Lord, what are you trying to get at? Notice the little parenthetical mark in verse 11. Look at it. If perfection had been attainable through the little Levitical priesthood, watch now, for under it people received the law. Oh, brothers, don't miss this. Notice the tight connection between priesthood and law. Priesthood and law. Priesthood and law go together. In fact, we find out later in the chapter, the law was given on the basis of the priesthood. Now, what does he mean by this? When God entered into relationship with Israel, he was not establishing a secular nation. He was establishing a theocracy, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. God would be king, Israel would be his subjects, and the law of the land would be religious in nature. It's not that some laws would be civil, in emphasis, some laws would be ceremonial, other laws would be moral. They were all from God. He was to be the moral governor. So whether you're talking about laws regarding the functions of the tabernacle or honoring father and mother, they were all of one piece, all of a religious nature, calling for obedience to the covenant God by the covenant people. Thus it was the job of the priest to do two things in relationship to this law. Teach it to the people, watch now, and make atonement for the people when they fail to obey it. Remember, this is a theocracy. To break the law is not to offend the state, it is to offend God. Consequently, the priesthood needs to be in place when the law is given, because fallen people are sure to break the law. You see the inextricable connection between priesthood and law? Priesthood and law, they go together. If therefore, guys, watch now, it's necessary to change the priesthood, what must we concur? Verse 12. For when there is a change in the priesthood, has there been a change in the priesthood, guys? Please nod and say yes. There is necessarily a change in the law as well. Notice the imperative nature. Necessarily. By compulsion, a change must occur. Not just a shift in emphasis, not just a proper, fuller interpretation. The idea is one thing being put in the place of another. You say, well, Art, what is this change? Look at the next chapter, verse 8. Chapter 8, verse 7. For if that first covenant had been faultless, there would have been no occasion to look for a second. For he finds fault with them when he says, Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. Sounds like the Mosaic covenant to me. For they did not continue in my covenant, and so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, Know the Lord, for they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. Priesthood and law. When did this change occur? On a Friday afternoon about 3 o'clock. He asks for something to drink, and then he says, It is finished. Everything to which the law had pointed. He says, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. At that very moment the earth quakes, rocks split open, the veil leading into the Holy of Holies is torn from top to bottom, the old covenant and everything attached to it, the priesthood, the sacrifices, the temple, the law, rendered obsolete. Perfection had been attained. God's plan to save had been completed. Jesus was raised from the dead. He ascended into heaven and was installed on his kingly throne. And it was there that God declared him to be our high priest, perhaps the greatest illustration that the old covenant was now a thing of the past. Chapter 7, verse 13. For the one of whom these things are spoken belonged to another tribe from which no one has ever served at the altar. For it is evident that our Lord was descended from Judah, and in connection with that tribe Moses said nothing about priests. This becomes even more evident when another priest arises in the likeness of Melchizedek, who has become a priest not on the basis of a legal requirement concerning bodily descent, but by the power of an indestructible life. For it is witnessed of him, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. For on the one hand, a former commandment is set aside because of its weakness and uselessness, for the law made nothing perfect. But on the other hand, a better hope is introduced through which we draw near to God. And it was not without an oath, for those who formerly became priests were made such without an oath, but this one was made a priest with an oath, and by one who said to him, the Lord has sworn and will not change his mind, you are a priest forever. This makes Jesus the guarantor of a better covenant. You see what the writer of Hebrews is saying? You can't have it both ways. You can't be a Christian and return to Judaism. You have to cling to one and forsake the other. If the old covenant is in force, Jesus Christ is an unauthorized intruder into the priesthood. You hear what I'm saying, guys? If the old covenant is enforced, priesthood, law, the whole shebang, Jesus is an intruder into the priesthood, hence you have to give him up because he has violated the law of God. He has no business being there. On the other hand, if Jesus Christ, who has no ancestral connections to Levi, is indeed a legitimate priest from a different order of priesthood, then God has abolished the old covenant, the 10 Commandments. And what that means for you is the Mosaic law is not your law. For when there is a change in the priesthood, there is necessarily a change in the law as well. For me, understanding law began with that verse right there. Biblical theology shows you that even before the Mosaic law was given, there was embedded within the Scriptures hints of its inferiority, its temporality, its obsolescence. Melchizedek. Moreover, built into the law itself were the indicators of its own inferiority, its own temporality, its own obsolescence, unending sacrifices, priests replacing priests. It wasn't getting the job done. And after that law had been given, there were signs of its temporality, inferiority, and obsolescence, promises of a new covenant. I mean, I find this, with all due respect, brothers, to be irrefutable. I really do. I don't have answers for all of the questions, but it seems to me that coming at this business exegetically and not laying a systematic theology grid on this thing leads you to the same place over and over and over again. Matthew chapter 23, verse 2, starting there. I'm thankful, brother, that this verse is here. You want to know why? Because I always have to preach a better message than I can live. I think it's a bunch of false piety when people say, I never preach anything if I'm not living it out. I can't lower the standard for everybody else just because I don't live it out perfectly. What that means is I try and preach it humbly with an awareness of my own failures and an acknowledgement of those failures. What he's saying here is these Pharisees, for all of their hypocrisy, if they're bringing you the Word of God, then you need to do exactly what they say. I think that's exactly what he's saying there. For people living under the Mosaic Code. Yeah. That tells you something about a theology of office. There is the theology of office. So that while we are a priesthood of believers, that does not invalidate the existence of roles of leadership and followership. There is authority and submission even among equals. And just like there are unique roles between a husband and wife, there are unique roles between elders and parishioners. There is a theology of office. And everybody wants to make everything nice and egalitarian, so nobody can tell me what to do. But the New Testament, though not a clerical church we have, there still is authority and submission among brothers and sisters.